I went fishing one evening in what was then water, what I would call betwixt and between, a bit high for night and a bit low for day. You know, there's an in-between water level. And I went fishing, day fishing, and it was back end of July, and went day fishing, and caught possibly 15 or 20 sewin. Nothing bigger than 2 pounds, but you know what I mean.
In the day?
In the day, yeah. And on my way down the river, because I walked quite a long way, on my way down the river, I'd seen a salmon show in this particular place called Murphy's, and I thought, I'll go back up and I'll try for that guy, right, on my way back. So I come back up the river, and because salmon will often take just before the half light, you know.
Yeah,
And I knew where he was. So I walked back up, and there was a chap sitting on the pool, and he was a man called Lord Golding. He'd been an MP and in the House of Lords, very keen fisherman. So I said to John, I said, tell you, there's a salmon in here. I said, why don't you have a go for it? Oh, he said, I'm set up for night fishing now. I said, fine. So I had a chat with him, and I walked back up, and I thought I'll fish the pool above. And I went in there, and the same sort of scenario, I lost a couple of fish, boom, boom, in the fast water in the tail. And I thought, I'm going to sort one of these out. So I put a big tandem on, and I went in much higher up, and I hooked this fish, and it was just, I know it back end of July, it was about 10:30. And this fish, actually one of only two in my life, sea trout, took me out of the pool. And he went down into the run below and must have gone round John Golding's legs, because he was in the river fishing. Because I could see him looking down. I was shouting, and he couldn't hear me. And I thought, I'm going to have to cross. And crossing there was over your waders.
Yeah.
You know, it was
up to
chest
your waist.
waders.
Oh, yeah.
Chest waders, no, over the chest waders, right? And I went across. I got a bit wet, not
in
too
the
bad.
dark. That's scary.
Yeah. And then shouted again, because obviously I was closer to him, and he said, there's something going on. Anyway, we got the fish, and as it happened, he'd got, it was a hen fish, and it was before the days of digital cameras and all that, you know what I mean? We're going back now, 91 or 92. He had a sort of a keep net thing, which he used to fish a lot for barbel, this gentleman.
Oh, yeah.
And this thing looked like a boat, you know, it was like a weigh net. It looked like the shape of a boat.
Yeah. A sling.
Yeah, it was a sling. So we put this fish into this sling, and it weighed 19 pound 10. And then we put her back, and she was fine. You know what I mean? She went back.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the end of the story, actually, because I then went home. And to get home, I had to go under a couple of electric fences. They were that horrible height, which means you can't get over them. and they're a bit low to get under them, you know that. So I got home, and in those days I used to put my fly boxes out to dry. Always there was a boiler, you know, in the utility room. And I got home without one of my fly boxes. So the following evening, I went back up the Dovey. I went to the keeper's house, which is up on the main road between here and Machynlleth. I went to the keeper's house, and he was the keeper. I said, you haven't by any chance got a fly box? And he said, yeah, I've got your fly box. He said, John Golding picked it up. It was under an electric fence. I knew when it was gone. You know, I hadn't closed whatever.
Yeah.
And anyway, he said, what time did you get that fish last night? I said, I don't know, 10:15, 10:30. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
type of time. And he said, last night at the same time, he said, a man called Warbridge, who was fishing a mile below me, right? A mile or so below me, in the Sigui, had a fish of 19 pound one, he said. And those were two of the biggest fish caught on this river for years. And they were caught at the same time.
You know, good migratory rivers are really rubbish brown trout rivers because those fish can't get to that size if they stay in that river. So they have to go to sea. But,
That makes sense.
You fish the Neath with me. There's very few brown trout in there other than the ones that the club stocked. And typically, look at the Esk. It's a great salmon river, a really bad sea trout river. Well, it's a really bad sea trout river because it's a good brown trout river. So though that stock
It's either or.
has stayed in that river and not gone to sea and become sea trout or become a species that migrates from the river, whereas the salmon did. There are some exceptions to that. The Tivy in the upper reaches is a really good brown trout river. What's his name? Kite used to go down there.
Oliver Kite.
Yeah, Oliver Kite. He used to love to fish the Tivy because that's where Kite Imperial was born. So there are exceptions to the rule, but generally a good sea trout river is a really bad brown trout river.
Yeah.
Because that stock migrates to sea.
Yeah.
So coming back to what you were saying about feeding and what have you, I have caught sea trout that have had winkles or crustaceans in them, but they have been straight in off the tide.
Yeah.
I haven't done many autopsies because now if I catch a fish, generally it just gets returned. And
I guess as well, because sea trouts, I suppose they come, the peak time is really, I guess, now, isn't it? July,
yeah.
August. So there's not a great deal, perhaps I'm wrong in saying this now, the fly life, like in the spring, in the spring you get hatches of everything and all the brown trout, that's their peak.
Yeah.
So when they come in, they're not probably thinking of feeding.
No, that's right. And they and generally as the season goes on, the flies that hatch get smaller because it's just the way of things. At the beginning of the season, the flies are bigger, then they get smaller and smaller and smaller until it tapers off and there's no more flies hatching. So
I remember once, every time I see them, the foxgloves, the purple foxgloves,
Yeah.
I remember years ago, I was with Mark Morgan, and he pointed out, he said, as soon as you see these foxgloves come out, that's when the good sea trout normally come into the river, he said. Do you find that?
Yeah, 3 things: wild garlic, foxgloves, and a cuckoo.
So you'll just choose a handful of flies when you go?
I know what I'm using. I know what I want from my sea trout. I'm not interested in anything else. I know through trial and error when the river was full of fish. These flies have been proven and trusted between us all. Do you understand, Ceri?
Yeah. There's nothing new to be...
There is. I don't give a shit what they put out there. I know with a score.
He's the same with Trout, mate.
I'm obsessed. I was an obsessive angler. I never had one. My son, my daughter, my wife had 6 sons. Not one of them in sea trout season. Am I saying lies? I postponed my wedding because the sea trout were running.
And you even took it on dates with the riverbank?
I married my brother's babysitter. Yes. Oh God, wow. we were fanatics, man. Yeah. My brother never worked from the age of 36. He gave it up to go fishing.
My dad was a mad keen fisherman.
Was he a doctor or something?
Yeah, he was a doctor. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
he'd come back to Wales. My dad was Welsh speaking. My mum was English from Norfolk. And they moved back. He ran a practice. He was the old Dr. Finlay type.
Yeah.
You know, he would go out and see his patients. When we were kids, we very rarely saw my dad. The phone would ring. My mother was an unpaid telephonist in those days.
Yeah.
And he'd be off to the farms in the middle of the night. But he loved fishing. It was
Where was this then?
Abu Dhabi in Tawin.
That's what you were brought up
Yeah,
as,
that's where I was brought.
Right.
And I was very lucky. And my father taught me. He was one of the best casters I've ever seen. You know, I go back now, and he used cane rods.
Wow.
And as a little boy, Mum would say, I was one of 6 kids. I was the eldest boy, 3 boys and 3 girls. And he would take me, on his farm was on the estuary of the Dovey, high up near Dovey Junction, the railway. And Gwynant, lovely man, was the farmer there. And Dad could fish the tidal piece. And you know the local club own it. And New Dovey Fisheries, most of the river, was left to them. And they run it really successfully, very well. But Dad could fish this private bit. And as a little boy, we'd have to walk for half a mile along the river embankment to the Dry Nook Pool, or whatever it was called, I forget. And he would carry 2 rods, Ceri, in those days, 2 cane rods. One would be 10 foot and one would be 8'6". I remember that. Kingfisher lines, silk lines on the reels.
Silk line, yeah.
And he would wade in the lovely old black Dunlop thigh waders in those days. And he'd wade in at the tail of the pool in the evening. The tide was out, of course. And I can still see it. You'd see a lot of midge floating down the river. It'd be flat calm. And dimples, fish coming up all over the place, sucking them in.
Would he be fishing for trout then?
No, this is honestly true. My father would then turn to me and he'd say, there were lots of little ditches and streams running in, because I'd go off and play in them, catching the minnows. I was bored. I didn't want to watch my dad fishing. He'd wade out. And he'd have the big rod, which used to have, in those days, I remember it, on the gut cast. I think it was the start of nylon, you know, for casts. But gut cast and kingfisher line, which had to soak in the water to sink, if you wanted it to sink.
Yeah.
He'd have a haslam on, which was a famous Dovey fly.
Haslam, yeah.
Do you remember it?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there were 2, if my memory serves me well, beautiful fly. It had a Palmer body over silver, and I think from memory, probably a hen pheasant wing, or maybe a bronze mallard, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But it used to have 2 ibis feather slips on either 2 horns, basically, running down the flank, each side of the wing.
Yeah.
And I think the female was red, 2 slips of red, and the male were blue slips.
Right.
I'll never forget them. And I say, Dad, I'll let it soak. Now, so we say, for the sake of argument, he started at 7:30 in the evening, and the tide wouldn't be in there until 11:30. So he'd fish then. And he'd go in with his little 8'6" rod. He's a very good caster. Fish delicately. Can you believe this, Ceri? He'd be fishing with a size 16 or 14 black pennel dry.
Yeah.
Dry. Cockhackles. Stiff.
Yeah.
Right? And he'd be catching suin from half a pound up to 2.5 pounds.
In daylight now?
In daylight, yeah. I mean, this was... When the light was going, he would then come ashore, put that rod away. Where's my rod? And I'd show it with the line pulled off the reel, soaking in the stream.
Yeah.
Good boy. And he'd take that out, and he'd wade deeper as the light started to go. And then he may catch 3 or 4, what we would call big suin, 4 to 6 pound.
Really?
And he was doing this. And the best of it was, and this is what sticks in my brain, he'd turn to me and he'd have 2 Hessian sacks tied up in his fishing bag. And he'd open one and drop, he kept everything in those days, bar the small ones. He'd put 20-odd suin in the one bag, 20 small fish, right? And in the other, 3 or 4 of the bigger fish he caught later. And then he'd tie the string around the top.
Or like a keep net?
No.
Oh, they were dead?
Dead, oh yeah, to take home.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I'll tell you why. It wasn't greedy. They all did it in those days. But my dad would say, right, boy, You start dragging that bag along the river embankment towards the car. The car was half a mile away. I was 8 years old. And he'd set off with the bag with the big fish in and his fishing tackle ahead of me. And then he'd come back to find me. I was petrified. It was going dark. And I was dragging this bag with all these suing in, being bitten to death by midges. You never forget these things.
No.
And then the next morning, for example, he'd be in his surgery in Abu Dhabi, and they'd be in there and say, Mrs. Joan Nanty Essin would be there to see him. And in Welsh now, they'd be talking together, and he'd be going through her records, and he'd say, you need to eat decent diet of fish, dear. And he'd turn round to the sink in the surgery and give her 2 suin. And he'd give them to his patients. And
there'd be a queue every time the day after he went fishing.
People used to say, did they really need to see you about medical things, Tom? But he did that with the aim of giving them fresh fish. Yeah, we ate sea trout regularly.
If you don't lose your flies, you won't catch fish.
Yeah.
And then when you're not used to a river,
Yeah.
and then you lose a couple of flies, and you think, oh, geez, not again. You know?
Yeah.
And then you start to get tired.
Yeah.
But the good thing what we did then, we stopped.
Yeah.
And then we had a brew.
Yeah.
And then after only half hour,
Yeah.
this was like midnight, something like that, and you were fresh then to start again.
Yeah. It's always good to stop and readjust.
Yeah.
And have a bit of a reflection on what's just happened.
Yeah.
And what's happened so far in the evening. And sometimes by doing so you can maybe figure something out that maybe you think might work later on in the night. And it's not always the way, but by doing the same thing that you were doing in that certain pool earlier on in the night, and there's nothing saying that that's going to work in the next pool.
Yeah.
So we might have to ring the changes. It's always good to ring the changes because no 2 pools are the same. So structure of pools totally different. So if we're having these gullies in front of us and the fish are on a drop off or something, then maybe because they are right down in the gully, we're going to have to then utilise sink tips.
One thing I noticed as well last night, big difference from you and me, you were fishing much stronger nylon leader than me.
Yeah.
And then I did up to £10 then, and I'll probably put £10 on again tonight.
Yeah. Well, I was actually only using 12 last night.
Yeah.
That's light for me.
You only fish 15, he said.
Yeah, so I always go with the 15.
That's if there's a flow, I guess.
Yeah, if there's a good flow, and it's more of a precaution than anything, having a heavy diameter, because a thicker diameter line. I mean, it's always there as a precaution for when maybe you never know. It's like with sea trout fishing, you never know what the next fish is going to be, so be prepared.
Yeah.
And always using £15 line, I've always felt more confident into the fight.
Yeah.
So
you can bully them a bit more.
Yeah.
Then,
So like fish I've hooked this season, I've landed fish up to £12 this season.
Wow.
Using £15 line, but it's
there's so many overhanging trees and branches and snags and rocks.
Yeah.
You've got to bully them, haven't you?
Yeah, you've got to put the brakes on them sometimes. It's like the fish I said last week that I lost as well into the roots. I was putting some pressure on him, but the line never snapped. The hooks pulled out before the line. So that was telling me, it's the right thing to do. But like I explained about the thinner diameter, it can play a big part in low water, thinner diameter.
Yeah.
By just dropping down maybe to 12, £10, even to 8 if you feel more comfortable. Just giving more movement into the fly.
The rivers change constantly. The gravel beds shift, banks get eroded, there are new holes here, there and everywhere. So at the start of the season, rather than me go seeking fish, I go and check the wade-in lines. Oh, there's a big hole there. I didn't know that was there. That must have reappeared or appeared over the winter. I'll cast a fly and watch how my line comes through the pools. And I'll get all of this intelligence, effectively, to dictate later on how I'll fish that pool. Okay? So all of that is accumulative. The more you go, the more your reconnaissance is done, the more you get to know what you're going to do. So come, say, June, when it's really the bread and butter stuff, June, July, I generally have a very good picture of the river, where the fish are. I'd be speaking to other anglers, where were the fish caught, how high, how low. Even I'd know what the tides are doing. And I generally get there, say, midsummer, you're talking about 10:30 before it goes dark. So I'd get there 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, check all my gear, have a wander up and down the river, spot fish if I can see the fish, and then sit and wait. And just as darkness goes, the fish generally show themselves. You know, you hear the tail go, and then another fish will start, and then you can mark these fish off. They're doing their little patrol, showing you where they are. Once that's done, as darkness descends, and sometimes even just on dusk, I'll have a go with small flies fished fast in that thin water. Occasionally you'll have a couple, but you won't really disturb the water. Those fish are going to stay there. They're not going to move. Come out, give it a rest, and then I start on darkness. On darkness, that's when I'd get in, and I'd start to work my way through the pool.
One of the memorable nights for me was to go to the river one night, and it was starting to rain. And it was windy. And I'll always remember, I went to fish the Rhywlas there, and I drove up the valley a bit. There were 2 cars. I fished through the Rhywlas, didn't catch anything, by which time it was raining, proper rain, right? West Wales rain. Right? So I come back and I think to myself, I'll go to fish one place, you know what I mean, see. And I went up to St. John's, and I went in and I caught one take, 14-pounder. One take.
I take that.
Right? Nothing else. And by which time now I was wet through. So I went back to the car and I thought, shall I fish on or not? So I drove back down the valley. I got to St. Morgan, which is close, not far from home. And I thought, shall I have a go? Well, I might as well. I'm wet. I'm whatever. And we're going to have dirty water tomorrow, probably, with all this rain, because it was still raining. So I went in there, and in the tail of St. Morgan, I hooked a small, 3-pound fish, right? I say small, not that small, but. And lost it landing it, because I tried to drag him up on the stones and he went back. I was quite happy, you know what I mean? It didn't bother me in the least. And then I thought to myself, shall I go down to Dolgolanen or not, which is round the corner, another 150, 200 yards. And I thought, I'm soaked. And I was soaked, and I thought, I might as well. You know what I mean? I'm not going to get any wetter than this. So I went in there, and I'll always remember right at the beginning, and it was that first inkling of the first light of dawn, right? First inkling. It wasn't light at all, you know what I mean? It was just, you had a feeling it was coming. And I hooked a fish, and he took me around that pool, and he was a big fish, you know, big fish. And I came to land him now, I was going to beach him. And I brought him back, and by which time the light had lifted slightly, right? Still dark, but I brought him in, and he was lying there. I can see him now. And my dropper, he was on the point fly, got stuck in some Japanese knotweed that was growing out of the bank. You know that stuff?
Yeah.
And jagged it, see? And I couldn't drag him any further, right? So I reeled in, came down, pulled this Japanese knotweed out of the stones. I got down to him, and he tumbled, and he went back in. And I dived in after him. I was already wet anyway, because I would have loved to have being able to see how much that fish weighed, because I had a weigh net. And he just, in my arms, literally went.
You actually touched him?
Oh, yeah, I had my arms round him.
Oh,
so partly
no.
around him. You know that sort of feeling? But of course, they're quite slippery, and as you know, and there we are. And I think I would have probably then got probably the best
Your personal
race
best.
that I would have ever had. Well, he was in the upper teens,
Yeah.
but I would have had a brace, maybe 32, 33.
Oh, I see, because you had one earlier, yeah.
And I can remember before I caught that fish in 2014, I'd crossed the river, the moon was shining, and I put on a muddler. And the moon was shining just under the bushes there, and I crossed like that. I thought, I'll give it a little go there. And I flicked under the bush, Ceri, like that, and I thought,
Yeah.
And I started pulling this muddler back towards me, and the wake that followed this muddler, I couldn't believe it. It was
was the moonlight, you could
absolutely
make it out.
enormous, lit up by the moonlight. I couldn't pull that muddler fast enough back to the shore. I did not want that fish on the end of the line.
Really?
I was terrified, absolutely terrified. I was shaking. I thought, I can't believe it. It's actually followed it from the start. I'm doing something right. I pulled it back as fast as I could, blew my whistle. Where's Andy? He's down in the bottom pipe pool now. I was like, what's wrong? Oh. But funnily enough, about a fortnight before, Andy had gone down the river and he'd come back. He said, I've never been so frightened in my life. He said, I looked down, it must have been just getting dusk. He said, I cannot explain to you the size of this fish that just went over my waders.
Wow. Was that before or after?
That was what a fortnight before.
So you didn't take?
No, I was
You-
pulling it so quickly that he didn't have a chance. And I was like that.
I'd have been gutted if you didn't
And I could see
take.
him, the tail, turn around and go back. I was like, shaking. I couldn't believe it. I thought, did he see that? Where is he? No.
Looked after 5 guys one night, you know, and lovely guys, we caught nothing. Get in the Jeep on the back of finish the night, down a road out on the bottom beat. I reversed into a tree, smashed the back end of my Mitsubishi, you know,
You reversed into the tree, or they did?
in the
You
pitch
did?
black. I reversed into the tree, smashed the back window, which was quite funny at the time, innit? But
Through the window?
yeah, the back window, completely shattered, yeah, hit an oak tree. I pass that tree every day and I think, yeah, remember that. And yeah, so we get back, you know, took them back to the digs and they give me 500 quid in cash. Like.
Did he, as a tip?
Yeah, 500 quid.
Wow.
So
I went towards a new window, eh?
yeah, I think they took the funny side of that, I took the funny side of that. There's one guy then, he came, you got Paradise Flats, which goes into the gold mines, which goes into Paradise Flats. Yeah? At Whistlepool, gold mines, Paradise Flats. Yeah? 3 unbelievable names for pools, yeah?
Yeah.
So as it was getting dark, I'd always take, if it was guiding, I'd always take the rod down to Paradise Flats, you know?
Yeah.
It's a chance before it gets dark for me to have a look how good their casting is, what their capabilities they are, you know, where, you know, how I can fish certain areas, you know what I mean? Sometimes you know, yeah, we got a chance tonight, and other times then you've got to kind of change your tack before you start, because you know, as I said earlier, you know, the whistle pool can be quite a long cast. But this guy could fish, he was a good guy. Will, I wouldn't say second, and let's just call him Will, yeah? And we got on Paradise Flat, so I'd always fish, you know, it was a tail of a long pool, shallow water into fast water. You know, it'd always be a good place for a fish as it's getting dark. You know, they come through the fast water, they tuck up on the bank. Yeah? You know, you'd watch them many a night just bow waving through. Yeah. So he has a fish about 2 or 3 pound. You know, so it's getting dark, so we go up to the whistle pool and I think we fishing a secret weapon. First run down, 7.5 pounder, bar of silver. Yeah, stunning fish. Nothing with this guy, blasé, like, you know what I mean? Next run down, 13.5 pound sea trout, bar of silver. You know, he's had 3 fish now, mint, proper silver fish. The 4th run down, you know, you're done now, like, and you're thinking, you know, this guy's made up. I think we've done another two runs down, nothing, yeah. So he's kind of, oh, is that it? Like, you know, we finished now, we? I said, well, you know, can have a coffee on, or, you know, it's done now, innit? So you get back to the car, again, a bit emotionless, kind of, you know, there's not much emotion with the guy, if that's the right word. And he just turns around to me, and the last thing he said, I was hoping for a 15. You come away, you're a bit disappointed, you know. You know, I think in...
Some people think they just see what's
on
on the
well,
magazine.
that's it, then. And, you know, and you have seen now, certainly with, say, your trout and salmon, you know, whereas to get your name in trout and salmon, say when I was 12 or 13, living on the estate, you know, you'd be a hero in school with a 3-pounder or a 4-pounder. You know, you caught a 5-pounder. You know what I mean? You'd be talking that class forever and a day.
So anyway, I was sitting there on the grass now. I watched my brothers cross the river, see the white water where they were crossed, and out of sight. And I was left there on my own, shivering and frightened. And then all of a sudden, crash! Right opposite me, but there, see? Big sea trout jumped, see? And then crash again, another one.
Jeez.
Oh, Christ! So anyway, I picked my rod up and I waded in and I was trying to cast now, and I put the badger on. What made me put it on, I don't know why. I tied him up and I put the badger lure on. The tandem on, right? And it was a hell of a job to cast with it because there was a bit of wind. Now in this very spot, in low water, normally you wouldn't fish there. It was just shallow piece, but it had a bit of a neck on it. So, and it used to open up, and the light used to hit it there, even on the darkest of nights. It was a sort of light, and you could see the gravel line on the other side, like, see?
Yeah.
And I'd be casting at this gravel, trying to get close to it, couldn't get, and working my way down, and another sea jumped close, frightened the life out of me. And I'm fishing away, and then all of a sudden, man, I was into a fish. It was the first big fish that I had hooked.
And you're on your own?
And on my own. Frightened to death. Splush, splash, crash, white water everywhere. Oh, hell of a job to hold on to it. Played it there for I don't know how long I played it. And I don't know, many times it had gone slack and I thought I'd lost it. And I was pulling in like that. And then all of a sudden I looked up, there's a fish lying in front of me. He was lying at my feet. Huge. I scooped the fish up onto the bank.
No net to do
Nothing. That. I killed the fish and I put it down on the bloody grass bank by the side of me. I couldn't stop looking at it.
Where were your brothers?
My brothers hadn't come. They were still down in the pool. I couldn't get over it. Oh, my God, that was the first big sea trout that I caught. How at that time I couldn't estimate it, right? I just knew that it was very big.
If you've enjoyed listening to these trailers and want to listen to the full episodes, please consider becoming a Patreon. We will get weekly podcasts and access to over 140 episodes, behind the scenes photography, plus other exclusive content and prizes. To become a Patreon, visit patreon.com/casting with Ceri Jones, or you can find the link on my website castingwithcerijones.com.